It was my first day at the coffee shop. The air smelled like roasted beans and milk foam. I stood behind the counter, nervous, holding my small notebook. Mr. Gray, the shop owner, was standing near the espresso machine. He was tall, with grey hair and a serious face. He didn't smile, not even once. Everyone called him the angry boss. He looked at me and said, "Don't be slow." Customers hate waiting. His voice was cold. I nodded quickly. "Yes, sir." My hands were shaking. The first customer came in, a young woman who ordered a latte. I tried to make it fast, but I was too nervous. The milk spilled a little over the cup. Mr. Gray saw it. He shouted, "Be careful, you're wasting milk." Everyone in the shop looked at me. My face turned red. "I'm sorry," I said quietly. But he just walked away, angry. I felt small, like a child who did something wrong. During lunch break, I sat alone in the back room. I wanted to cry. I thought about quitting. But I needed this job. My mum was sick, and I had to help pay the bills. I told myself, "Be kind. Maybe he will change." When I went back to the counter, he was still angry. Angry at the noise, angry at the customers, angry at everything. A man asked politely, "Could I get a muffin, please?" Mr. Gray said, "It's right there." "Can't you see?" The man frowned and left without buying anything. I whispered, "That was rude." He heard me. He turned around and said, "What did you say?" My heart jumped. I looked down. "Nothing, sir." He stared at me for a moment, then walked away again. The day felt long. The coffee machine hissed, cups clinked, and Mr. Gray's voice filled the air like thunder. When it was finally time to close the shop, I cleaned the tables and stacked the chairs. My hands were tired, but my heart was even more tired. As I left, I said softly, "Good night, Mr. Gray." He didn't answer. He just turned off the lights. Outside, the sky was dark and quiet. I took a deep breath. I looked back through the shop window. Mr. Gray was still inside, counting the money, his face hard and lonely. I felt sorry for him. Maybe he wasn't just angry. Maybe he was sad. I whispered to myself, "Tomorrow I'll try again." Maybe he just needs a little kindness. The next morning, I walked to the shop early. The street was still quiet. The air was cold, and I could see my breath. I told myself, "Smile. No matter what happens, just smile." When I opened the door, Mr. Gray was already there. He was cleaning the counter, his face serious as always. "Good morning, Mr. Gray," I said. He only nodded, no smile, same as yesterday. Soon the first few customers came in. A young man wanted a cappuccino. An old lady came after him and ordered black coffee. The shop began to fill with voices and the smell of warm bread. Then it happened. The old lady touched her cup and said softly, "Oh dear, the coffee is too hot." Before I could help, Mr. Gray shouted, "It's coffee!" "Of course it's hot. What did you expect?" The old lady looked shocked. Her hands trembled a little. I quickly took a napkin and said, "It's okay, Mom. I'll get you a new cup." She looked at me with gentle eyes and said, "Thank you, dear. You're a sweet girl." I smiled at her, trying to make her feel better. Mr. Gray said nothing. He just turned around and started wiping the same counter again and again, but I saw his eyes. For a moment, he looked sorry, just a little. When the lady left, I went to clean her table. There was a small note under the empty cup. It said, "Kindness makes the day warm." I smiled. I wanted to show it to Mr. Gray, but I didn't. Maybe he wasn't ready yet. Around noon, the shop got busy again. Mr. Gray moved fast, making coffee, shouting orders. "2 lattes, 1 muffin, hurry up!" I tried my best to keep up. When I dropped a spoon, he sighed loudly. But this time he didn't yell. He just said, "Be careful next time." I looked at him, surprised. It was a small thing, but it felt big to me. Later, when the rush was over, I noticed him staring out the window. Rain started to fall outside, soft and quiet. For a second, he didn't look angry anymore. He looked tired and sad again. I wanted to say something, but I didn't know what. So I just said, "You must be tired, Mr. Gray." He didn't answer, but he didn't get angry either. He just kept looking at the rain. That night, as I left the shop, I thought about the note the old lady wrote. Kindness makes the day warm. Maybe she was right. Maybe one day it could warm Mr. Gray too. It rained all morning. The sky was grey, and the sound of water filled the streets. I ran to the shop with my umbrella, but my shoes were already wet. When I opened the door, the smell of coffee wrapped around me like a blanket. "Good morning, Mr. Gray," I said, shaking the rain off my jacket. He looked up from the counter. "You're late," he said. I checked the clock. I was only 2 minutes late. "I'm sorry," I said softly. He didn't reply. There were no customers that morning. The rain kept everyone away. The shop was quiet, too quiet. Only the coffee machine made a soft hissing sound now and then. Mr. Gray sat near the window, arms crossed, staring outside. Drops of rain slid down the glass like slow tears. He didn't say a word. I wiped the tables, refilled the sugar jars, and tried not to disturb him. After a while, I made a small cup of tea. The warm steam rose into the air. I hesitated for a second, then walked to him and said, "This is for you." He looked surprised. "For me?" "Yes," I said. "It's raining. You might need something warm." He stared at the tea for a long moment. Then he nodded and took it slowly. His hands were shaking just a little. "Thank you," he said quietly. It was the first time I heard him say that word. I smiled. "You're welcome." For a while we just sat there, him by the window, me behind the counter. No yelling, no noise, just the rain outside. The silence felt strange, but nice. After finishing his tea, he said, "You work hard." I looked up, surprised again. "Thank you," I said. He nodded. "Most people don't last here." I laughed a little. Maybe I'm not most people. He didn't smile, but I saw the corner of his mouth move, just a tiny bit. When the rain stopped, a few people came in. The air felt lighter somehow. He even said good morning to a customer, though his voice was still a bit rough. The woman smiled back. It was a small moment, but it felt big. That night, as I walked home, the streets were wet and shining under the streetlights. I thought about his quiet "thank you." It was small, but it stayed in my heart like a warm light. Maybe kindness really can change people. Not in a day, not in a week, but slowly, like rain softening the hardest ground. The next week the rain was gone. The sky was blue again, and sunlight filled the shop. I liked mornings like this. They felt soft, like a new beginning. Mr. Gray seemed quieter these days. He didn't yell much anymore. Sometimes he even said, "Good job," when I made a nice cup of coffee. That small praise felt huge to me. One afternoon the shop was almost empty. He was fixing the coffee grinder. I wiped the tables, humming a little tune. Then, out of nowhere, he asked, "Why are you always so kind?" I froze for a second. I didn't expect that question. I smiled and said, "Because it makes people feel better." He looked at me, his eyes serious. "But not everyone deserves kindness," he said. I thought for a moment. "My dad used to be angry too," I said softly. "He shouted all the time. But one day he changed." Mr. Gray's hands stopped moving. He looked down. "He changed?" "Yes," I said. "Someone showed him kindness, even when he didn't deserve it." The room was quiet. Only the sound of the coffee machine filled the air. Then he sighed, a long, tired sigh. He said, "My wife left me last year." I looked up, surprised. He wasn't shouting now. His voice was low, almost broken. "She said I was too angry," he continued. "She said I made the world around me dark." He gave a small, bitter laugh. Maybe she was right. I didn't know what to say, so I just stood there, listening. He went on, his voice shaking a little. "When she left, I stopped talking. I stopped smiling. I just worked. Every day. It was easier to be angry than to be sad." I felt something heavy in my chest. I had never seen him like this. He wasn't scary anymore, he was just human. "I'm sorry," I said quietly. He nodded. "It's not your fault." Then he looked at me and said, "I forgot how to be kind." For a long moment, we just stood there. The sunlight came through the window and touched the floor, and I saw dust floating in the light like small stars. I said, "It's okay. You can learn again." He looked at me, and for the first time he smiled. A real smile. Small, shy, but real. That day, something changed between us. The angry boss wasn't just my boss anymore. He was someone I understood. A week passed after that talk. The shop felt different now. It was still the same place, same tables, same smell of coffee, but something in the air had changed. It felt lighter, warmer. Mr. Gray said, "Good morning" to me every day now. His voice was still deep, but softer. Sometimes he even made jokes, short ones, but funny in his own way. I started laughing more too. The shop didn't feel so cold anymore. One busy morning, a group of students came in. They laughed and talked loudly, but Mr. Gray didn't shout. He just smiled and said, "Take your time, kids." I looked at him, almost in disbelief. He noticed and raised an eyebrow. "What?" he asked. "Nothing," I said, smiling. "You just seem different." He grinned a little. "Maybe I am." Later that day, a woman spilled her coffee. She looked nervous and said, "I'm so sorry." A few weeks ago, he would have yelled for sure. But this time he just grabbed a napkin and said, "It's fine. Happens all the time." The woman smiled with relief. And I smiled too. He really had changed. When the rush was over, we sat down for a short break. He handed me a small paper bag. "For you," he said. I opened it. Inside was a slice of chocolate cake, my favorite. "You told me once you liked chocolate," he said. I blinked in surprise. "You remembered?" He nodded. "Of course. You work hard. You deserve it." I laughed. "Thank you, Mr. Gray." He smiled. "Call me Tom." That was the first time I heard his real name. It felt strange and nice. Before I left that evening, he said, "You know, I used to hate mornings. Now I look forward to opening the shop." "Why?" I asked. He looked at me for a moment and said, "Because someone taught me how to be kind again." I didn't know what to say. So I just smiled and said, "You're welcome, Tom." He laughed softly. "Maybe you changed me." I shook my head. "No, you just found yourself again." As I walked home, the sky turned orange with sunset. The air smelled of coffee and rain, my favorite mix. I looked back and saw him through the shop window, still smiling as he cleaned the counter. And I thought, maybe kindness doesn't just change others. Maybe it changes us too.